So good afternoon. My name is Nicholas Allen. I'm the director of the Willson Center for Humanities and Arts at the University of Georgia. And it is my absolute pleasure today to welcome Nick Hunt to a conversation about his most recent of his four books, Outlandish, which I've been reading with great pleasure over the last weeks and months. Nick's website is also something that I would direct you to. Is a wonderful collection there of travel essays, reflections about the climate and the environment, about his practice of walking, some of the things we'll talk about today, but a really rich and generous resource of ideas, reflections, observations, sounds, images of the various travels that he's done throughout, not just the continent of Europe, but further afield too. And I suppose, Nick, in welcoming you and thank you for your kindness in being with us today. And I know you're running between many social engagements. So that sense of generosity was there very much in the reading of Outlandish too. It's a very open book, even though you cross many lines and borders and countries and territories. An open book to time, an open book to place, an open book to history, and an imagination of scale that's so much beyond the human, and yet you do it on your own two legs. So I was going to ask you just to start with about this, how you got into walking. And when you started walking, why didn't you ever stop?
My mum, I think, she got me into walking. She was a walker and always took me out, dragged me up hills, made me appreciate nature against my will from an early age. And I remember one of the kind of sort of profound moments of my life was being not much more than 6 or 7. And you know, those moments when you see something that kind of, I guess what you feel is awe. And when you're a child, you don't really have words for that. I remember on a walk, just wanting to stop and look at a hillside with a sheep, and the sun was going down and everything looked very intense and golden. And I remember she let me stay there while she walked on back to the car. You know, she trusted me to kind of, she understood that I needed to see that thing for whatever reason. So that left a big impression, just the kind of importance of those moments, I guess. And often you find those moments through walking.
Yeah. And that's a beautiful way to describe it. So many of your images in the books are painterly, not in any studied sense or not still lives because you're always moving, but you do a beautiful way of writing these visual sketches of place. Have you also in your past, I mean, as you were then growing up afterwards and walking, when did you start writing about it, or did you sketch about it first, or how did you describe it in your own head and to other people?
Well, I think I was always writing more fiction, writing short stories. That was my thing. I've actually got a book of short stories coming out next year, which is very exciting. That's the first time. But I didn't really think about writing about place or landscape or any of that stuff until I did this walk in. Actually, this is a good time to talk about it. 10 years ago today, exactly 10 years ago, I set off from the Hook of Holland to walk on an 8-month walk to Istanbul. And this was something I guess I knew I wanted to write about it, but that wasn't my primary reason. It was a journey I'd always wanted to do since reading the books of Patrick Leigh Fermor, who did that journey in 1933, 34. And it was always something that I had in the back of my head as an ambition that I wanted to achieve, to follow his footsteps and see what had changed across 8 countries in 78 years since he did that walk. And then, you know, I came back with a huge amount of material, and that became a book. And then my kind of career, I guess, as a travel writer, nature writer, whatever I am, I'm not sure. I think of myself as a travel writer, but that really came out of that walk and that book. But it wasn't what I intended to do at the start.
Sure. Well, you're definitely a writer in motion. I mean, I love that about the books, and not even just the motion of your physical self, but all the thoughts that attend it. They're so Outlandish is so rich with observation and reflections that go from, I mean, so many different kinds of topographies and landscapes, but so many different scales and human experiences too. But thinking about that now 10 years ago, and you thought that perhaps going back to the Fermor visit before this, you know, breadth of time, and that Europe had become one thing. And now, you know, for you arriving in the Hook of Holland 10 years later again, Europe would look different again. And not just because of Brexit and things like that, but because of borderlands, some of which you passed through. And I wondered, have you any thoughts about that now, 10 years later?
Yeah, very much. I mean, there's kind of, you know, that I went to chronicle, I guess, how Europe had changed since just before the Second World War, you know, and obviously these monumental changes that that have happened since Patrick Leigh Fermor did that walk. But then, as you say, in the last 10 years, there's really been three kind of barriers, I guess, to someone like me or a British citizen doing that walk today. The pandemic, obviously, however temporary that might be, it's the idea of wandering and meeting random people and sleeping in the houses of random strangers, feels quite far away. And the refugee crisis of 2015, 14 changed, I think, a lot of people's views about borders and freedom of movement. And then obviously Brexit. I mean, I was really struck by the fact that that walk would simply not be possible today, because the British citizen can only spend 90 days in the EU, in a sort of normal circumstances. And then technically, they could walk for 90 days and come back and wait and then go back for 90 days. But they couldn't do that walk my walk was an 8-month continuous journey, where I didn't have to think about visas or paperwork or passports or, that was the joy of it. And it really saddens me to think that that's just not an option for people doing that now. It seems so small and so petty, and such a shame.
It's interesting, isn't it? I'm thinking now as you say that about having to only be able to walk for a certain period, because some of the bits of Outlandish that really stuck in my mind, those moments whenever you're walking through the Polish forest and you come across the old Tsar's Road and you see the old 19th century, perhaps even earlier than that, image of an old walkway of an empire that's entirely gone, lost, that you would never really, the freedom that you had to wander, to get lost, and the sort of act of faith that's so much involved in giving yourself up to these strange places would be foreclosed, as you say, by these kinds of diminutions that have happened more recently. It's surprising.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really struck me about the book too, and I love that in the description of the forest, was the idea of being, you had this understanding that it was a 12,000-year-old living interconnected ecosystem and organism. You describe it as making sense at the cellular level, so that even beyond these sort of human arrangements, you have a real empathy with those non-human parts of the landscape. So would you share for us a little bit, beyond the plastic sea and all those other strange places you went, what company you found as you were walking with things that weren't other people?
Yeah, I mean, there's the first thing that comes to mind is these 4 animals that emerged as I thought of them as kind of totem animals of the journey, and they're kind of all, the cover's really quite literal. It's the 4 landscapes I walked and the 4 animals: reindeer, ibex, bison, was it in the shadows there, and the horse. And really, I mean, going through them, the reindeer were an animal I encountered in the Cairngorms, which was the first landscape of that walk. The Cairngorms are mountains in the northeast of Scotland, and they are Arctic in character, and you get this Arctic tundra. It's the only part of Britain that classifies as an alpine Arctic environment. And the reindeer are relatively recent reintroduction, but were there, long time ago, hundreds or possibly thousands of years before, but they've been returned to that landscape. It's the only part of Britain where you can find reindeer free roaming out over the mountains. And then the other animals that emerged for me were the European bison of the Białowieża forest in Poland and Belarus. That I think if you showed a picture of a bison to most people in Europe and said, "Is this a European animal?" they'd say no. It looks like something we associate with the American kind of prairies, but they are deeply of our continent, and again have been here for tens of thousands of years. And this forest is one of their last strongholds. It's their last sanctuaries. And the other creatures were the ibex and the horse, but we can maybe talk about them a bit later.
Yeah. But I'm just struck so much ways in which the work itself becomes its own kind of refuge. You're reminding me as you talk and saying that these are deeply of our continent. There's been an interesting conversation in Ireland recently about the idea of a rainforest and temperate rainforest. And these are not words that people associate with that locality or with that landscape. And you had that comment also in the introduction to Outlandish about having been in the Amazon and never being able to imagine that the next year it would burn.
Yeah.
You know, your books are sort of books of hinges in time in a way. I mean, you talk about deep time, and I wanted to ask you about that in a minute, but they're full of these moments where you see things very with great depth, but also with great immediacy too. And does that speak, I mean, to this apparitions also of animals in your consciousness as you're walking through? I imagine the lynx and the horse, these sort of agile creatures, the reindeer too, being so adaptable through these difficult terrains.
Yeah, I mean, it helped me see the places and understand them on a, they're kind of, the thing that really struck me actually with the reindeer was when I saw the reindeer and then almost 10 minutes later, it started to snow. And then it became a very, very cold, intense, wintry walk. And it was almost like the reindeer had kind of summoned the snow. And my strong impression was that the reindeer were kind of, it looked like parts of that Arctic tundra that had been given sentience and kind of brought to life and started walking. You know, their kind of pelts looked like the snow-covered frosted ground, and their antlers looked like the kind of, the branches of trees. They seem like parts of the landscape that have been brought to life. And very much so with the bison too. They're so kind of that forest. They're so, what's the word? Kind of archetypal. They like spirits of place.
So, I mean, I really, there's one thing I loved about the book, and it surprised me at the end. You said it's beautiful, and I don't feel like I'm speaking with a thriller writer, and I'm going to give away the who did it at the end. But as someone joked with me, maybe they should be called why did it instead of who did it. But just thinking about the end, you have this idea that we are walking into a future where these kinds of places and experiences may not be possible for people, that we're coming out. I mean, many of the landscapes that you look at are sort of relics of a deep time that was of the Ice Age, that was of the most early sense of human imagination, or if not memory, at least the kind of a cultural inheritance of myth and folktale that describes these places.
Yeah.
And yet the springtime that you say that we're walking into, this hotter future, it almost felt, when I think of deep time, I think of Tim Robinson in the west of Ireland, mucking about amongst the rocks and looking at Grant and, Hugh McDermott looking at the raised beach and looking down the way. But actually, I felt in your work at the end, oddly enough, that we were surfacing and we were in a kind of a transition period from one deep time into another, that whatever way the climate was changing, that we had come to the end, or at least I shouldn't say the end, but we were in a phase of transition that we can see, which not many humans before us have ever been able to see, I think, in quite the way we are now. Does that make sense to you?
It does, yeah. We've got the kind of telescope going forwards and backwards. We've got this huge lens suddenly, and we find ourselves in the middle of it. And as you say, it's very easy to slip into end time thinking, and in many ways it is the end times of many things, but it is also the beginning of plenty more. And these great hinges, as you say, it is this kind of hinge moment where we can see ourselves at this hinge, probably more than we've ever done before. So yeah, we kind of very much a transition, and the book is really a kind of, it didn't start out like this, but I think it became my attempt to try and navigate through some of these changes that are happening, and just to kind of work out where I am in it. I think it's a book that it feels like a book that's a bit of a question mark for me anyway. It doesn't really arrive at a conclusion other than, we're in the middle of this process and it's affecting everything around us, and nobody knows the map anymore.
It's all the better for it. And actually, you're making me think, about the idea of the question mark. Have you found, you said you started off writing little fictions, or different. And I noticed that on your web you were thinking about writing a novel, and you have the short stories coming out. And you say that I'm, whatever kind of writer I am, I'm a travel writer. But you've been different kinds of travel writer, haven't you? According to the different kinds of travels you've done. I mean, it's also, travel writer is also a condition that is mutable too.
Yeah.
Then, I mean, did you find, was there any bit whenever you were on your walk and you thought, oh my God, like I see this and I kind of feel it, but how do I write this? Was there any bit that sort of stumped you?
Yeah, constantly. And I think possibly the less successful parts of the book are talking about, the kind of go into the the facts and figures a little bit. I mean, really as a way of saying I don't understand them, but they're always the things that leave me a bit cold. I didn't set out to write a book about there was so much about the climate or about deep time or any of this stuff. It was really the kind of hook originally was just these anomalies of landscape, the only part of the Arctic in Scotland, Europe's only desert, this kind of thing. And then it just became kind of impossible not to bring the climate in very quickly, because in Scotland, in the Cairngorms, I was looking at what was a glacial landscape until 11,000 years ago, looking at this snow patch called the Sphinx, which is it's normally the last bit of snow that survives in Britain from winter to winter. And it has, it's been a permanent fixture, just a little patch in a very odd part of the mountain. It doesn't look particularly sheltered. It's just kind of this odd little blob of snow that stays from year to year, and it's melting more and more frequently due to climate change. And just seeing, that's a good example of looking back and looking forwards, because you kind of look at a landscape like that and you think you're seeing the past, you're seeing the scars of a glacial age, and the kind of physical damage that glaciers have done, and the way they've shaped the landscape. And then suddenly I had this vision of, oh, this is what the Alps are going to look like in 50 years time, 100 years time. I'm looking at the future, or not even the future, I'm looking at the kind of the present in a lot of places where the ice has melted or is almost gone. So yeah, it felt like being at that hinge at that moment and seeing both things together.
Yeah, no, you do very well. I mean, and one thing I love about the book is that sense of the unfamiliar without the estrangement that you do manage in the writing. And it's a very difficult thing to do, to make the thing seem strange without it being Gothic. I mean, you still, and I wonder, is that to do with the faithfulness again, this idea, the act of faith of walking, of giving yourself up to people so frequently in the book, that you're also giving yourself up to places as well?
I think so. And it's also, I think it's just having a kind of, sorry, it's like it's going off, slightly childish sense of sort of adventuring in a landscape and just kind of getting a bit lost and exploring. And I say in the introduction, it's not a travel book or a nature book so much as a book of fantasy. And that's what it felt like, walking through the canyons of this desert in the south of Spain, which is layered with this strange kind of modern history of spaghetti westerns and this sort of Wild West identity that's been placed on top of what that desert really is. And knowing that it was also where Moors from North Africa, that was an Islamic part of Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years, and you can still see evidence of that. So it felt like this kind of fantastical landscape of where I could be in North Africa or Islamic Spain, or the Badlands of kind of Arizona or Utah, just by turning my head. Or it's where they filmed Lawrence of Arabia. I found, they filmed 3 minutes of a scene for Lawrence of Arabia, but I found the oasis where Peter O'Toole and Omar Sharif appear in a short scene in this film, that the palm trees were imported from hundreds of miles away. And none of it should be there. It's just these kind of strange little fantasy oasis in the middle of a desert in Spain, pretending to be Arabia.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. But I loved all those sort of displaced places as well, supposed to go with displaced persons. But it must be different. There was one description you had, and whenever any of you out there get to read the book, there's a really wonderful sequence about the Carpathia, about the plains of Hungary, and about the sense of openness of the steppe that opens out before you. And it must also be fundamentally different walking through that kind of open landscape. You describe it being in the shelter of the Carpathian Bowl. And I've traveled in Romania and Transylvania quite a lot over the years. And I had the echoes of these places and those words in your imagination. But it must be fundamentally different, the quality of experience in walking through that ancient Polish forest, or indeed walking. And I mean, we're talking about walking here. You nearly died falling down the side of, was it one of the pikes? Whenever you slipped down the snowy and grabbed your friend's leg when you were able.
Fell
Yeah.
hike, yeah, that was in the Lake District in the, yeah.
I'm talking to people who are walking here. It's not like you or I taking the trot around the neighborhood. I mean, this is out there. But anyway, it must be, there's also so many different conditions of perspective in the books too. I mean, do you have one that you favor in? Do you like the big open sky? Do you like the forest? Do you like Dungeness by the water?
I mean, I loved, it was quite amazing going from the shelter of the forest where I felt quite safe, enclosed, protected, and unseen. And actually something I write about a bit in the book, which I haven't really written about before, is the fact that it's I think a lot of travel writers don't admit this sometimes. It's quite hard sometimes just being in another country and not knowing the language, not knowing the culture, not knowing how to do anything.
Yeah.
Some days you just feel like you want to hide, or I do anyway. So I felt quite safe within the forest. I felt kind of enclosed and concealed. And going to Hungary, where these grassland steppes in the east of Hungary, which is just, it's just grass as far as you can see. And I expected, I think, to feel very exposed and kind of observed in that kind of landscape. But strangely, it was so desolate that I felt quite secret in that place, because there's just no one there. You don't see anyone. It's just this great, it's like being at sea, and that landscape really felt like drifting on this very still, perfectly flat sea, which became, I think, one of the most sort of magical and strange and wonderful landscapes of the walk. Ostensibly, it would be the most dull because it is just grass and grass and grass and grass and a completely level horizon. But yeah, it was one of the, I write in the book about portals, this idea that a landscape can be like a door into imagination, really. And for me, that grassland steppe was my portal into Mongolia or Central Asia, places I've never been. I've always been kind of fascinated by, but I've never been to the Mongolian steppe. But I have been to the Mongolian steppe through going to Hungary and seeing this great, perfectly flat, level expanse of grass, and knowing that landscape channeled in the Mongols and the Huns and the Avars, and like thousands of years of invasions and migrations that have shaped Europe and especially Hungary to this day.
Well, I mean, I thank you for that. I mean, you can listen, anyone listening to this conversation can see from the verbal description what the richness of the writing is like, and even reading actually is an experience of your traveling through those portals, that kind of that Narnia-esque version you have there of the Hungarian steppe with these other places that can be seen through it. And how a walk, such as you undertook, is really a journey through a landscape, through to somewhere else, not just in a landscape. So these are just our little brief lunchtime conversations. I could talk with you for hours, and I genuinely want to recommend to you all of you now. The holiday season is coming up. It's a really wonderful book. I enjoyed every page. And Nick, you've been so kind to speak with us, and I wonder, would you do us the final kindness of reading a short passage from the book so that we could get a sense of it in your voice, which would be really wonderful. Thank you.
I'd love to. How you mentioned one that you might like to hear. Is that right? Something from the towards the end?
Just that, I was so struck by the end is so powerful and so beautiful, but there's so many parts of it that you could read from, whether it was the traveling through the forest or walking, whatever you decide.
I'll read that because it references something that you mentioned, which was walking into the spring, and this requires just a little explanation. I quoted a poem by an artist called Alec Finley, who wrote a wonderful book about the Cairngorms, very strange book exploring the place names. And he had this poem, "How did we first come here? Following behind the reindeer, walking backwards into spring," which I didn't really understand was a strange kind of cryptic riddle that was about the ancient history and the human migrations and the reindeer migrations, and also referencing this idea of a Gaelic folklore about a ferryman seen riding backwards on a reindeer, warning people about coming falls of snow. And the book kind of explores some of that possible mythology. But I'll read, this is just from the very end, and it just describes the four landscapes, and that's what that poem is about. There is the Cairngorm's Arctic tundra, as frosted as reindeer pelts. There is the green of Białowieża, as dark as memory. There are the blasted minerals of Europe's only desert, badlands that were once a sea, in the earth tones of a painted cave. Finley's lines come back to me. How did we first come here? Following behind the reindeer, walking backwards into spring. And I see anonymous herds filtering through time and place, mass migrations in response to a rapidly changing climate. Like the shrinking glaciers, the rising seas, the spreading desert, the light and shade that lap across the continent in a tide of trees. These movements of animals and people are the living pulse of the planet. The frozen past recedes from view, and the future is dark, unknown. We are all walking backwards now, unable to see where we are going, into the spring that is coming with the melting of the ice.
Thank you, Nick. And we couldn't have a more beautiful guide.
Thank
Nick,
you.
author of Outlandish, thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to your book of short stories and all the travels that are yet to come. And thank you all.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers, Nick.
Thank you.